Welcome to Oh Hell No with Nicole.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Oh Hell No podcast. Today I have Allison Kugel. She is a syndicated entertainment and pop culture journalist, an author, and also an entrepreneur. Welcome, Allison. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question I want to ask, and I always ask people this question because I always try to see if there's a link between, what we initially went to school for and what we're doing now in the present time. So what was your major in college?
Oh, wow. You're going to laugh. I was a criminal justice major.
Oh, so was I.
Get out of here.
Yes.
Well, for me, those were the only classes that I didn't want to cut because I just found them so interesting. And I'm still like totally a true crime groupie. I study like famous court cases and stuff in my free time. But yeah, I actually thought that I might go into law enforcement when I was much younger.
Wow, that is so interesting. So tell us, how did you get from there to where you are today? What was your first job out of college?
Well, it's kind of started in college because my first foray into being in the professional world, I was actually working in a jail. I was working with the people who were arrested and put into the holding cells because they couldn't afford bail. And I was interviewing them to see if they qualified for a public defender. And it became just a really harrowing experience working with a lot of these people. And I just had an epiphany and realized that it just wasn't for me. As much as I found it interesting, it just wasn't for me. And then to make money, I found that I had some connections in, I guess, I don't know if it's the fashion industry or what you'd call it, but I knew a lot of photographers and I wound up making a lot of good money doing modeling. And one thing led to another, and I ended up living in California. And then I actually, to supplement my income when I was in my early 20s, in between gigs, I started working for this woman who was a PR and marketing person, and she was having me do all of her writing. And one day she said to me, you're a really, really good writer. And no one had ever said that to me before, and I never even knew that I could write before, but it kind of planted a seed in the back of my mind, and life just kind of moved me in that direction, for lack of a better way to put it, because I just kept taking writing jobs. And then I wound up working for a newswire when I was in my very late 20s. And they mainly did press release distribution, but they had an article section that was kind of fledgling. And I said to them, would you be interested in me heading up your article section? And maybe I could do something like celebrity interviews, and that would get a lot more traffic to the website. And what I was basically told was, well, if you can make it happen, you can do it. And I didn't know anything about how to go about doing that. I didn't really have any connections. I just sort of willed it to happen. And I got one person to take a chance on me, and then another person to take a chance on me. And that was about 13 or 14 years ago. And then before I knew it, that's what I was doing. I mean, like hundreds of interviews later, I just sort of created the job.
Wow.
For myself.
That's pretty amazing.
Thanks.
So once you started how do you remember how you got that first celebrity interview and who it was?
Yes, it was January of 2005. I remember it very clearly. I did some outreach at the time. Reality TV had, just started becoming really, really popular, and we figured we had the best shot at that at the very, very beginning. And I remember the very first person I interviewed was one of the original cast members from the first season of The Apprentice. Her name was Katrina Campins, and yeah, she was on the first season of The Apprentice.
I remember her.
You remember her?
Yes.
And yeah, we sent out some queries and she said yes. And we were like, oh, okay. And that was the first one. And then I think after that, we had a connection to the show, The View. My boss actually had a family friend that worked over there, and we got Joy Behar to talk to us. And then it just, we kind of just kept, we just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing until more and more doors started opening.
So I guess your first interview, you did that and you enjoyed interviewing people. So I mean, you've done some really high profile celebrities. In case you guys don't know people, I post Allison's interviews as well. So if you want to see what she's doing, it's up on my website. That's one place, and she's syndicated, so it's all over. But she's had like great interviews. So when you interview these people, do you ever feel like intimidated or nervous or, oh my God, this is so not for me? Or are you always excited and ready to do it?
Well, in the beginning, years and years back, when I was, first of all, much younger, but also it was all brand new to me, it's changed so much over the years, because when I think back to those first few interviews, it was more of this, like, oh my God, can you believe they're talking to us? And oh my God, can you believe we have this person on tape? And it was more like that. It was more like that surreal, oh my God kind of a thing. And then as time went on, I found that I went from looking at it that way to then transforming into a professional journalist who just considered it all in a day's work. And then from there, something clicked in my mind. I think it was maybe around 2010 or 2011 where I had an epiphany, and I realized that what I was doing and what I had created was a great gift, because I started to realize that when I would have these conversations with people, and no matter how famous they were and no matter how accomplished they were, every exchange would be an equal exchange of energy. So I would learn a lot from them, but they would also learn stuff from me, because they would say things to me like, wow, I never thought of it that way. Or, oh, that's so interesting, that insight that you just shared. I kind of look at it as this exchange of energy, exchange of ideas. And in an exchange, it's the energy is flowing back and forth. So while you're learning a lot from this person who's accomplished so much, what you don't realize, or what I didn't realize until I had this like aha moment, was that they're also learning a lot from me, and they would tell me so, and they would tweet about it and say, I did this great interview and she asked such amazing questions, or I feel like she really got me. And I thought, wow, they're not only making an impression on me, I'm making an impression on them. And I can only imagine how it's helping or inspiring people all over the world who are reading it. And so it's just this amazing flow of energy. And I started to look at it much, much, much differently. And at this point, all these years later, I don't get nervous. I don't get intimidated. And I think the reason is because I've come to understand that, and this might sound a little airy-fairy, but in my mind, and maybe because of the spiritual stuff that I've been studying for a long time, I feel that anybody who is on earth is here because their soul has a great deal to learn. So I feel like if somebody's here, it's because they have just as much to learn as I do, no matter who they are. And that thought kind of comforts me. And so I really don't get nervous in that way. I really, really don't. If anything, if I do get nervous, it's more of the way that a person would get nervous before a blind date.
Right.
Because you don't know if there's going to be chemistry. You don't know if you're going to click.
Right.
And if you don't click, it's not going to be a good interview. So that's the only thing that goes through my mind.
Wow. So what about pop culture attracts you?
I'm a weird contradiction. I'm a walking contradiction, because a lot of pop culture, I have a love-hate relationship with pop culture. I don't know that I really like pop culture. What I actually love is speaking to somebody who has become a pop culture figure and getting beyond the pop culture image and getting to know who that person is as a human being. So I'm kind of like the anti-pop culture. My approach is like an anti-pop culture approach because I prefer to strip that all away and really figure out who that person is, the real person.
Right.
Because it's so funny. I'll interview somebody and they're just a person, and they just have a regular life. And then the next week I'll be in the supermarket and I'll read some crazy story about them. And I'm like, what the hell is this?
Right. Like I was just talking to this
I
person.
don't like that stuff very much.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth.
Absolutely. When you first started out, you said you were working, for someone. Are you doing this on your own now? Or do you still work for, I don't know how it works when you're a journalist. Like, I know there are some that work for papers or newspaper or magazines or whatever, but what is your setup?
My setup is I actually have two setups. At this point, I no longer work for the Newswire I used to work for. I now, because I got to a point where I wanted to own my intellectual property, so all of the interviews now, I do them completely independently and I own them 100%. And I have different deals set up with a lot of larger outlets around the world. So I do it that way, but it's all 100% mine. I own them. And then I also am an editor of a newspaper here in New York.
Nice.
And they also publish my interviews as well.
That's amazing. So what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in becoming a journalist?
Wow. First of all, read. Read and read and read as much as you possibly can, because in order to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. I learned how to write from reading because I'm a voracious reader, and that's what builds your vocabulary and helps you fall in love with the use of language and the way we can use language and manipulate language to express different ideas. Because I always say that it's not that I'm so off the wall or crazy, because people will read things that I write and they say, oh my God, is that true about you? And I'll say, it's not that I'm any different from you. I just know how to put all of the crazy, quirky thoughts and feelings that we all have into words. That's the only difference. So I think you have to read in order to develop that muscle. And I think the best advice that I would give, I can't just pinpoint it to journalism because I think it applies to everything. You have to go out there and create your own seat. So instead of begging for a seat, you have to get out a hammer and nails and wood and build your own chair.
Yeah.
Because that's really what I did. So whatever that means to you, whether that means, offering to work for somebody for free to get that experience, whether it means knocking on doors, or whether it means just writing articles and then pitching those articles to different places so that people can notice you and notice how well you write, and then other opportunities can come your way. I love the fact that now people can create their own blogs, people can create their own podcasts, because you can build your own chair. I mean, that's basically what it is. And a lot of times in this world, you have to, people always say, don't put the cart before the horse. A lot of times in this world now, you have to put the cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. You have to build the cart in order to be able to hitch the horse to it. That's just kind of the way things go now. But just read a ton and write a ton and knock on doors and get people to post or publish your work.
Yeah,
that's my best advice.
Yeah, that's great advice. So you've been around for a while, just like me. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts about how things used to be done as opposed to how things have evolved with social media? Like, what would you say are some pros of, being able to, put yourself out there right away and get people to notice you and respond to you, and some cons about the very same thing?
Well, I think once upon a time, very few people had a public voice. Very few, only a privileged few had a platform and a voice, a public voice. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's great that now anybody can have a voice. The only problem with it is that not everybody uses their voice responsibly. So whereas we used to have a strong filtering mechanism and you'd have to work your way up the ranks to have that type of a voice and a platform, now it's just instant. And I think that anything that is too instant and comes too easy, people take for granted. And sometimes they misuse and abuse.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what do you sacrifice to do what you do? Because I have to imagine that you probably have a pretty busy life.
Yeah, it's well, I'm a single mom.
Hmm.
So, that's a full-time job right there.
Yep.
And I work for a newspaper, and that's a full-time job. And then I have this passion project, which is my interview column, which is kind of another full-time job. But I think when it comes to writing to me is like breathing. So somebody asked me the other day, what do you get out of writing? And I said, that's like asking me, what do I get out of breathing? It's survival. It's the way that I process the world around me. So it's something that I'm just compelled to do. And it doesn't really feel that part of it just never feels like a sacrifice. It almost feels like it's something that I have to do. I have to write. I have to get that stuff out. And I have to take my thoughts and my feelings and put it into words and get it on the page. So that really never feels like, oh God, this is hard work. It just never feels like that for me. I think time management is really the only issue, and it's an issue every single day of my life. But I just do the best I can every day. And one thing that I love is that, whereas I grew up with a stay-at-home mom who was just sort of always accessible. I'm a very hands-on mom, but I think what I lack in constantly being home, I more than make up for in the fact that my son is seeing a really positive female role model.
Mm-hmm.
When my book came out, he came with me to one of my book signings and he sat next to me behind, at the table, and he had a Sharpie in his hand and he would sign the book also.
Oh, that's so cute. I love it.
So, and I think that it just sets a really, really good example. So although I'm constantly juggling everything and that part feels like a sacrifice, I feel like it's really going to instill some great things in him.
Yeah, I agree. So what do you do to stay grounded? Because a lot of people who would be, if people were doing what you're doing, they would, get a little big headed. I mean, you interviewed Lenny Kravitz. I mean, come on. So, how do you keep it all in perspective?
I keep it in perspective the same way I described before when you said, do I ever feel nervous about that? I keep it in perspective because I realize now with maturity that, first of all, it's a gift and a privilege to be able to have one-on-one conversations with people who have accomplished so much.
Mm-hmm.
It's I feel like it's been like how Oprah says, I feel like it's my own personal master class that I get to attend on a regular basis. So I'm grateful. And to me, I feel like I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words. It doesn't give me a big head. When I was younger, when I first started doing this, when I was around 29, 30, I did have that little twinge of that kind of feeling that came over me, but that is long gone. Because first of all, when I was working for that newswire, I worked there for 8 years. And then I had a falling out with my boss, and I was forced to resign. And I sank into a deep, deep depression at that time. That was about, that was about 7 years ago, because I felt like I had lost a limb, because like I said, I feel like this is my life's work. And when I was forced to resign from that job, I said, oh my God, I was Allison, the celebrity interviewer. And if I'm not Allison, the celebrity interviewer anymore, who am I? And I had this identity crisis because all of a sudden I didn't have that cachet. I wasn't getting invited backstage to concerts and Broadway shows and film premieres and this and that. All of a sudden, everything was stripped from me. And I'll never forget this because this was the funniest thing. My intern sent me I had an intern at the time, and she sent me an email, and she wrote in the email, "Hi, Allison. Due to the recent change in your status, I'm no longer interested in continuing to intern for you." And I remember thinking, like, even my intern,
Right.
has no interest in me anymore. All of these people that were orbiting around me that I thought were my friends, all of a sudden weren't interested in returning my phone calls. And I think after going through all of that and losing that and having to then figure out who I was without that, my ego no longer attaches itself to those things. So even when I was able to rebuild about a year ago, and I'm now interviewing people that I could have only dreamt of interviewing years ago, but my ego is no longer integrated with that job at all.
Wow.
Because it got beaten to hell to the point where it's no longer there.
That is so amazing. I was listening to an Oprah podcast the other day, and she had someone on that I don't know if I'm sure you watched Oprah. She used to have this doctor come on and talk about, like help people. And that lady went through that very same thing where she lost, her money. She wasn't on the show anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And she said the very same thing. If I wasn't this, who am I? And she had to figure that out. So it's so crazy that you just said that. That's crazy.
Are you talking about Iyanla Vanzant?
No, not her.
Oh, okay.
But another black slim doctor. I can't remember her name. I listen to so many podcasts. It's like overload in my brain. But she definitely had like a come to Jesus moment where she said her life was in shambles and she had to kind of figure out who was she without all of those things attached to her,
Yeah.
Because now she didn't have them anymore. So.
But that's just it. But that's when you realize, wait a minute, I am a child of God. I am a human being.
Right.
I am a family member, a friend. I'm a person who's constantly learning and growing and getting, that's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And these other things are amazing. They're great. But it no longer defines who I am, and it's whenever I see somebody, particularly in the entertainment industry, who looks like they're not getting enough oxygen to their brain because they're just, their behavior, whatever, is just out of line, I say to myself, oh God, they've got the disease.
Right.
They've attached their ego to what they do. And if anything should ever come apart, they're really in for quite a fall. And the reason they're in for quite a fall is because they've set it up where their whole sense of self is attached to those things. I think the greatest thing that can happen to anybody in life is to have a moment in your life where everything is stripped away from you and you have to figure out who you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. So about your book, you wrote a memoir. So what made you want to write this book? Because you're still young.
It's called Journaling Fame, a memoir of a life unhinged and on the record. I wrote it because it was by no means meant to be a look back at my entire life because I'm only halfway through my life. But I wrote it because I had lived with anxiety and panic attacks for my whole life up until that point, from the time I was a kid. And I had some, after I lost that initial job, the anxiety had become so intense that I had actually been to the ER several times and really had a really rough time of it. And as I was healing and getting better, I started keeping a journal. And I realized that I wanted to write a book to share my experience with anxiety. It was like a mishmash of anxiety and OCD and panic and depression, just that whole... And anyone who has it knows exactly what I mean. It's like those 4 prongs, they kind of all work together. And I wanted to write a book to share my story and to really, really go into detail about what I went through on that journey my entire life, dealing with that and living with it and kind of integrating it into who I am and healing from it. And then I also had the notion to write about some of my interviews. And I thought, well, if I can combine the two, it'll get a lot more press and it'll get a lot more people interested in picking it up, specifically the young people who are really into that pop culture and entertainment kind of stuff. And I thought that if I made a hybrid memoir where I'm telling my story about being a highly sensitive person and living with anxiety, and I'm using the celebrity interviews as kind of a backdrop, and the combination of the two is kind of like mixing sugar with medicine. I figured a lot of people would pick up the book wanting to hear behind the scenes stuff about my interviews. And while they're reading the book, since I know that 40% of Americans live with some type of anxiety, so many people will pick up the book and read my story and say, oh my God, that's me. I'm so thankful that I picked this up because I see that I'm not alone now. And I, got to read this woman's story. So that's what that book is about.
Yeah, really, because I was talking to my cousin like a couple of months ago, and we were talking about how a lot of young people suffer from anxiety and don't even know what it is,
Right.
and they don't talk about it. So then you never really get to have that conversation about, hey, this thing happened to me and I'm not sure what it is. So I think
Yeah,
it's awesome that you share
many,
that.
and I never realized, because growing up in a Jewish family, we live for therapy. I mean, like, Jewish people love therapy. And but I never knew that in other cultures it's more taboo, right?
Yep.
So that sets a lot of people up for a really hard time, because if they can't talk about it at home and it's taboo to ask for help or to go for help, you've got really a perfect storm. Or you've got a lot of people out there that just don't know where to turn, don't know who to talk to, don't know, like you said, even how to identify it, because maybe they're so divorced from their own emotions that they don't really know what's going on. They can't pinpoint it. So I felt like my book would be just a good conversation starter and a good best friend to anybody who is in that situation and doesn't quite know how to process it, and they can read my story and hopefully get something out of it.
Awesome. So I read someplace that you created an app. Is that correct?
Yeah, I created an app for the PR industry, actually, called UPitch, where people could post their news stories or whatever it is they want to pitch, and then journalists can kind of swipe through it and see if there's anything on there that they're interested in and connect with those story pitches. And it's been a work in progress, because we've definitely had some bumps, and I have a new team taking over, and hopefully they can work out the kinks and get the app where it should be. So we'll see what happens with it.
Well, good for you. That's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
So do you feel like you are living a purpose-driven life?
Oh, yes, definitely. Most definitely. Because I know that my work touches people all over the world, and that just means the world to me. I get letters from people. I got a letter from a 60-year-old man the other day saying that an article, not one of my interviews, but I have a weekly column at the newspaper where I work, and he said one of my columns inspired him so much that he had sunk into a depression and was feeling really bad about the fact that he was retired, and reading one of my column entries gave him the inspiration to feel like he can now be on to the second chapter and the second act of his life. And it just means the world to me to touch people with my work. And then also my biggest purpose, which is being a mom of a son. And everything that goes into raising a young man is my number one purpose. So 100%.
That's beautiful. I love that. I love when people get inspired by other people. That's why I do this podcast, because I feel like everyone's story, can connect with someone else. And if you're struggling through something or not sure about where to go with your career, someone has a story that you can identify with. So
It's so true. Yeah,
Yeah, I just really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your story.
of course.
So before I let you go, I have to ask you, have you ever had an interview where you were like, oh, hell no, like, I can't wait for this to be over?
Yeah, I have. I
Okay.
have.
We won't ask you to spill details because you're a professional.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I don't want to put anyone on blast.
no,
I
absolutely.
can't. I mean,
No.
I did a little bit in my book. Just read the book.
Okay. So this is the Oh Hell No podcast. So you don't have to tell me that, but you do have to share an Oh Hell No moment with us. And it could be, something professional, something personal, just a moment that took you back. You were like, what? Okay. And you got yourself together and pushed through it and, survived it, but it lives on in your memory.
Oh boy, where to even begin? There's like a million of them.
I know we have them all the time.
Uh, I'm gonna go a little general with this, just because the thing about me is that I'm a very kind, generous, giving soul. However, I do have a very strong sense of my personal boundaries and what I will and will not put up with in terms of the behavior of other people and how they treat me. So I am very, very outspoken when somebody crosses my boundaries. And I think people are taken aback by it because they see this petite, cute woman and they don't realize that there's this side to me that will come out, and it's like I'm my own pit bull when somebody crosses the line with me in a way that I find is disrespectful. There was this office building that I was working out of at one point years ago, and there was a gentleman working in the office building working for another company, and the landlord of the building happened to also be Jewish, and Jewish people tend to put mezuzahs, which are little Torah scrolls, like little Bible scrolls, in doorways all over wherever we live or wherever we work. And there was a man who worked in the building with me in a different office. And at one point, I realized that there was a mezuzah by his doorway that had been ripped off to the point where like half the paint was ripped off. And I went to the landlord and I said, this is what's happened. And I think it's really out of line for this guy to rip this off the wall. I take offense to it. And my landlord said, yeah, well, but he's a really good tenant and he's my biggest tenant and he pays on time and blah, 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 blah. And I said, do you mean to tell me that you're going to let something that could really be construed as a hate crime go because of money? And I said, you know what, I'm going to handle this myself. And I did handle it myself. And I did get in this guy's face a little bit, as I think anybody should. I think that especially in the times that we're living in now, whether it's racial or religious or gender or sexuality, whatever kind of discrimination, if somebody crosses that line and you feel that your civil liberties or your human rights or civil rights have been infringed upon, I think that we all need to have a voice and speak up, and that nothing should ever be so precious, including material success, that it overrides our principles, our personal principles, and our personal code of honor and conduct.
Absolutely. I agree. Good for you. Look at you with your little self.
Oh yeah. No, trust me. I can really get in somebody's face when I feel that they have infringed upon my rights in some way, or in human rights in general. And like I said, I think it's really, really important. That was definitely one of the biggest oh hell no moments. But yeah, I think that's so important that each and every one of us is not afraid to have a voice, and that we don't sell out our principles for $1.
Yep, absolutely. I agree. So please tell everyone where we can keep up with you and your stories and your column and your app. We want to know everything.
The best way to keep up with me is through my personal website, which is AllisonKugel.com. So it's AllisonKugel.com, AllisonKugel.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at the Allison Kugel.
Awesome.